Greetings everyone, and welcome to a new series called Deck Science, where we explore the intricacies involving the very nature of deck building. Today our focus is the deck spectrum, which is very easy to visualize, but here's a diagram anyways. As shown, aggression is on the left and control occupies the right, with mid-range intuitively stationed in the direct center. Every deck that you can think of and will conceive in the future will lie somewhere on this spectrum. In order to choose the optimal cards for the deck that you want to build, this spectrum is your first stop. First off, let's go over the extremities labeled here. For the most part, aggression decks jam-pack your deck with a ton of low mana cards that buff one another to maintain board control through attrition and gradually whittle your opponent down. The other variant, which is far more risky, is shown here, attacking the face as much as possible, taking advantage of the relatively low starting health and a common tendency for decks not to have taunts until turn 5. The key here is speed, because this deck sacrifices having stronger minions for a higher quantity of lower mana cost minions, increasing the chances of swarming your opponent with board control. This puts a heavy time limit onto an aggressive deck player like Zoo or Face Hunter and makes this style of deck extremely risky because there are no comeback opportunities. You either win quickly, ever vigilant for that point of lethal, or you lose spectacularly. The weakness of this deck is to keep yourself alive long enough to get out taunts and high health minions. Classes like Druid, Warrior, and Priest work well because their hero powers provide healing and armor, and their class-specific cards focus on outlasting your opponent's attacks as long as possible. The middle of the road is where most decks preside, where you are strongest around turns 6 to 9. The purpose of these decks is to build tempo, or some form of advantage, from the early game into the mid-game where your stronger minions appear to finish off your opponent. Early cards are meant to prepare for the mid-game, rather than deal damage like an early aggression deck, focusing on card draw, to acquire those powerful minions that will steamroll your opponent to a win. A more aggressive variant of the mid-range focuses on managing the board early, not necessarily clearing it, but whittling your opponent down and relying on your larger minions to finish the job instead of relying on maintaining board control. This style of play does not run out of steam like Zoo or Face Hunter. But what it gives up for sustain, it also loses power in the early game to be more powerful in subsequent turns. Having control, for the most part, means enduring and outlasting your opponent, so there is no time limit apart from your health points. This style of play involves a strong early game designed to survive the mid-game attacks into the late game, where you employ large minions that focus on gaining so much tempo that your opponent simply cannot keep up with you. Control decks rarely rely on combos at all, and instead look for early card draw and high mana cost minions with incredible abilities on their own. It abuses the fact that the mid-game only lasts about 3 turns from turn 4 to 6. So having a strong early game can help mitigate the damage during the mid-game, and the late game lasts pretty much as long as necessary. So a control deck thrives off of getting to that 10 plus turns. Also, you'll notice that a lot of control decks use spells and taunts during the mid-game in order to protect themselves and stall the game to the late game, where their deck will enter its strongest position. Knowing about this spectrum will help shave off a ton of possible cards that you won't even need to think about when building your own deck. Effect cards that buff others are most useful with decks that have pinpointed turns of aggression, but powerful single ability cards are best used to endure and outlast your opponent. Also, if you can identify where on the spectrum your opponent's deck is, you can begin to take steps to abuse their weaknesses. Practice by finding new decks and determining where on the spectrum they may be located, and also start to notice certain cards that always make their way into certain kinds of decks, and try and ascertain why. Soon you'll begin to see patterns that will help you choose the most optimal cards for whatever deck you wish to build, and if there are any cards you're missing, you'll be able to replace them with the best possible substitutes. So what do you think about the deck spectrum? Let me know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video, hit that like button and subscribe for more. And if you've never classified decks as early aggressive, mid-range, or control before, start now.